The wind rolled dry across the Arizona hills, stirring dust in restless spirals that rose, danced for a heartbeat, then fell back to earth. Out here, the land had a way of keeping its silence, broken only by the whistle of the wind through mesquite, branches, or the faint crack of a rock shifting under the afternoon heat. To most men, the emptiness of this country felt like punishment. To James Coulter, it was penance. For 12 years, he had lived alone in a cabin built with his own hands, set high on a ridge that overlooked a dry creek bed and a sweep of sunburnt pine. 12 years since he had last reached for a woman's hand. 12 years since the war had ended and left him with more ghosts than neighbors. His wealth sat in a bank in Prescott, untouched except for an occasional trip for supplies. Out here, it was only him, a shotgun, and the slow, steady ache of remembering. That evening, with the sky bleeding orange toward the horizon, James sat on the porch sharpening a knife. His eyes strayed now and again toward the tree line, though he didn't expect company. Nobody came this way unless they were lost, desperate, or both. He liked it that way. The world could tear itself apart beyond the ridges for all he cared. His exile was chosen, and he had no quarrel with solitude. But fate has a way of finding even the men who least wanted dot. It began with the sound-soft at first, then frantic. Branches cracking, brush snapping, feet stumbling over stones. James rose slowly, hand closing around the shotgun propped by the door. He thought perhaps it was a wounded deer. Or worse, one of the mining men drunk and reckless, heading into land that wasn't theirs. The sound came closer. Then, out of the shadow of the pines, she appeared, a woman barefoot, filthy, clutching to her chest what looked to be nothing more than a torn curtain or a strip of dress. White once, now gray with dirt and blood. Her arms were scraped raw, her lips cracked and trembling. Her eyes, those eyes, looked like they'd stared straight into hell and carried the smoke back with them. She stumbled, staggered one more. Step into the clearing, then collapsed at his feet. James froze, every muscle caught between instinct and disbelief. The shotgun hung heavy in his hand. She wasn't bleeding much on the outside, but her body shook violently, as though each breath might be her last. She lifted her face, whispered 2 words in a voice barely stronger than the wind. "Please." "Don't." It was not a cry, not even a plea. More a reflex, born of fear too deep to unlearn. And when the cloth slipped from her shoulder, James saw what she had tried to keep hidden. Scars burned across her back, like someone had pressed fire against flesh and forced it to remember. Twisted welts, shapes, and letters, carved like cruel signatures into living skin. It wasn't the wounds that made James stagger back. It was the way she curled into herself, as though she had learned to make her body small enough to disappear. And in that instant, Tennessee came rushing back, the girl he hadn't saved, the one he carried like a wound no doctor could mend. Sane broken. Stare, sane silence carved by pain. He had sworn never again. Never to walk away from the helpless. Never to let cruelty win without answer. James let the shotgun down slow, leaned it against the rail. He shrugged off his coat and knelt beside her. His hands, rough from wood and years of solitude, moved carefully, steady as prayer. He draped the coat over her shoulders, tucking it around her like a promise no one would hurt her. She didn't resist. Didn't thank him either. Just clutched the fabric as if it were stitched from safety itself. Wordlessly, he lifted her into his arms. She weighed little, bones and sorrow, more than flesh. He carried her inside the cabin, laid her gently on the narrow cot against the far wall. She made no sound, save the ragged rhythm of breath. James lit the stove, not for heat, but for heartbeat, the sound of wood crackling filling the silence. He brewed coffee bitter and black, older than he cared to admit. It gave his hands something to do besides tremble. Every so often he glanced toward her, still curled in the coat, still gripping it like lifeline. The firelight danced shadows across her face, and in its flicker he thought he saw a glimmer, not hope, not yet, but something unbroken. Later that night she stirred. For the first time her eyes met his. Only for a heartbeat. No words, no gratitude, no plea, just connection, raw and wordless, as though both recognized the emptiness in the other. James nodded once, like a soldier who knows when silence is stronger than speech. She turned away again, but the moment stayed at dawn. Her lips formed her first word since collapsing at his door. Water. He poured a cup, moved slow, careful not to spook her. She drank in silence, the sound of water against the tin cup, louder than the morning wind. When she lowered it, her gaze lingered a moment longer on him. It said nothing of thanks, nothing of trust. Only one truth, clear as the Arizona sky. "I'm still here." James returned to the porch later, knife and wood in hand, whittling against the restless quiet. Behind him, the cabin breathed with her presence. He didn't know her name yet. Didn't know if she'd vanish come morning, or if she'd stay. But he knew the truth as plain as the scars on her back. His life had changed. Whether by choice or by fate, he wasn't alone anymore. The hills felt different that day. The silence heavier. Like the land itself waited. James knew storms when he saw them. And this woman was a storm. The question was not if it would break, but when and what it would destroy before it was done. And as the sun rose higher, heating the dust into shimmering waves, James found himself whispering something he hadn't in years. "Lord, give me strength." Because he understood now, whatever chased her out of those woods was not finished. And when it came, it would find her here, on his land, under his roof. And this time, he would not walk away. Morning broke soft across the Arizona hills, painting the ridges in pale gold. The wind carried the smell of juniper and dust, a scent James Coulter had grown used to in 12 long years of solitude. For most of that time, his world had been measured in sunrises and sunsets, cattle calls echoing from far-off canyons, and the lonely scrape of boots on the porch. But now, as he set the coffee pot on the stove and turned to see the young woman still wrapped in his coat, he felt something in the silence he hadn't felt in years' expectation. She sat upright, cautious, eyes darting to the door as though she still expected someone to come crashing through. The coat hung loose around her frame, too big, but she clutched it all the same. When James offered a cup of coffee, she didn't reach for it right away. Only when he placed it gently on the table, stepped back, and folded his arms did she slide forward, fingers trembling as she wrapped them around the tin cup. Her lips moved before sound came, cracked and dry as desert earth. "Ellie." She hesitated, then added, "Ellie Rose." James nodded once. "James Coulter." She didn't answer, just lowered her eyes to the dark steam dot. He watched her sip slowly, cautious as a deer. And while she drank, his own mind drifted. Back to Tennessee, the place he never spoke of. 12 years gone, yet he could still feel the sticky heat of that battlefield, smell the powder and blood. He had been a soldier then, young and proud, carrying the flag of a cause he wasn't sure he ever believed in. What stayed with him wasn't the fighting, but the losing men, losing brothers, losing a girl with eyes like spring rain, who had begged him not to leave her behind. Her name had been Clara, a farmer's daughter caught between armies. James had promised he'd come back for her. Instead, he'd walked away when the flames spread too fast and the bullets too thick. Hadn't survived. And in the years since, the memory of her broken stare had carved itself into his soul. So James buried himself in land. He bought cattle, traded wisely, invested when other men squandered. The bank in Prescott knew him as a wealthy man. But out here in the hills, wealth meant little. His ranch hands drifted away, unwilling to live under a master who barely spoke. And when silence became his truest companion, James let it settle like dust on everything he touched Dot until Ellie stumbled into his yard. And with her came that stare. He knew too well Dot later that afternoon. She found her voice in pieces. They sat outside on the steps, the sun low and merciful. James whittled at a broken chair leg, chips of cedar falling at his boots. Ellie pulled his coat tighter, as though it could shield her not just from the wind, but from the memory itself. They used to make me clean their boots, she murmured, eyes fixed on the dirt path. James's knife didn't pause, only shaved another curl of wood. It was a camp, she said. Not official, not on any map. Miners and men worse than miners. They bought people, worked us till we broke, punished us when we didn't move fast enough. Her voice cracked, and James set the knife aside. First time I ran, they broke. My nose. She touched the crooked bridge gently. Second time, she shifted, pulling the coat back just enough for him to glimpse the twisted brands on her back. They carved me like I was rawhide. James's jaw tightened, but he kept still, knowing anger wasn't what she needed. I don't talk about the third time, Ellie said softly. Because I'm here, and that's enough. She fell silent then, and James didn't press. Some stories belong to the teller, and some to the grave. The following evening, as the sun bled red across the sky, James heard hoofbeats. Quick, uneven, climbing the ridge road. He stood, shotgun in hand, while Ellie stiffened on the porch, fear draining the color from her face. A man rode up a banker's vest, greasy mustache, the smug cruelty of someone used to owning what he pointed at. He pulled his horse to a stop and looked straight at Ellie. Ellie Rose, he called, voice slick with false charm. You got one chance to come back quiet. Ellie shrank against the wall, lips trembling. James stepped forward, shotgun low, but ready. She's not going anywhere, he said, voice steady as stone. The man smirked. Ain't up to you, old-timer. James cocked the shotgun, not aimed, but enough. The metallic snap cracked the silence. The rider sneered, spat into the dirt, and turned his horse. You'll regret this. His eyes lingered, dark with promise. Then he rode off, dust rising behind him. Ellie let out a shuddering breath she'd been holding since the first hoof beat. James stood rooted, watching the dust trail vanish. His finger eased from the trigger, but his chest was tight. Inside, Ellie collapsed into the chair, head in her hands. James poured her water, set it gently beside her. He didn't touch her, didn't press, only stood nearby like a shadow keeping. Watch. For a long time neither spoke. Then, in a voice barely audible, she whispered, You shouldn't have done that. They'll come back. James crouched so his eyes met hers. I've lived too long turning away, Ellie. Not again. Something flickered across her face, then not trust yet, not gratitude, but the faintest spark of belief that maybe she wasn't alone anymore. Over the next days, their lives bent slowly toward one another. James taught her how to stoke the fire without choking on smoke, how to carry water from the barrel without spilling. She asked little, spoke less, but every so often her gaze lingered on him with something other than fear. One afternoon, while he patched the fence, Ellie gathered wildflowers and set them in a cracked jar on the windowsill. James didn't mention it, but the next day he swept the porch clean for the first time in years. At night, she still woke sweating, trembling from dreams she wouldn't share. James pretended not to hear, though he stayed awake until her breathing steadied. He didn't know if he was fixing her or if she was fixing him. Perhaps it didn't matter. One evening, stew simmering in the pot, Ellie broke the silence at the table. You ever think, she said slowly, that some folks were put here not to save others, but to give them space to save themselves? James met her eyes. He wanted to answer, but words felt clumsy. Instead, he nodded, because if he spoke, he feared the wrong thing might come out. That night, as he sat by the fire, James realized something heavy had shifted. For 12 years, he had carried guilt. Like a chain, convinced his story ended on that battlefield in Tennessee. Now, with Ellie under his roof, he saw not just a chance for her to survive, but for himself to begin again. And deep inside, a truth stirred. He would kill or be killed. Before letting those men drag her back into hell, the Arizona night settled deep and quiet. Coyotes howled in the distance, their cries weaving with the rustle of wind through pines. James sat on the porch with his shotgun across his lap, eyes scanning the tree line. Inside, Ellie slept fitfully, the coat still wrapped around her. He had once sworn never again. Tonight, the oath hardened into iron. Whatever storm chased Ellie Rose from that camp was not done. But James Coulter was done running Dot, and this time, when the fire came, he would stand in its path. The hills of Arizona had their own rhythm, a steady drumbeat of wind through dry brush and the cry of hawks circling overhead. James Coulter had grown so used to that rhythm, he could mark time by it, measure the years like a rancher counted cattle. But since Ellie Rose had stumbled into his yard, the rhythm felt different. The silence wasn't lonely anymore. It was taut, watchful, as though both of them were listening for the same thing, footsteps that didn't belong. James rose before dawn, as he always had, but now he moved quieter, careful not to wake her. He built the fire, poured water for her, coffee, and kept his eyes on the doorway where she still slept wrapped in his coat. He didn't know what to do with this strange new duty, this need to watch over someone. He only knew he couldn't stop Dot. Ellie stirred more these days, venturing from the cot to sit at the table. She never asked for much, but she studied everything he did with eyes sharp as flint. How he trimmed kindling, how he mended a tool, how he carried himself like a man waiting for trouble. It was as though she was measuring him, deciding whether the cabin was truly a refuge or just another cage. Asterisk the third morning, she asked him her second word. Why? James paused with the kettle in hand. Why what? Why'd you help me? He set the kettle down, took his time answering. Because I was here, and you needed it. Her eyes narrowed, searching him for a lie. Finding none, she looked away. Most men wouldn't. James's mouth tightened. Most men aren't me. She didn't smile, not yet, but something softened in her shoulders. Asterisk that afternoon. James worked the fence line while Ellie sat on the steps, sun warming her face. She was quiet, but not the silence of fear. More like someone remembering. What quiet could mean when it wasn't filled with shouting. She braided a strip of cloth she'd torn from the curtain that once covered her. Fingers steady now, instead of shaking. James watched her from the corner of his eye. He didn't hover. He knew enough about broken things to give them space. But every swing of the hammer, every step along the fence, he was aware of her there, alive, breathing, and that alone felt like victory. When evening came, she surprised him by carrying in firewood without being asked. Her arms trembled under the weight, but she set the logs by the stove with a determined little nod. Didn't say you had to. James told her. Ellie met his eyes. Didn't say I couldn't. The words lingered in the air long after. Still, the nights were harder. She woke sometimes with a gasp, body rigid, eyes wide, and seeing things far beyond the cabin walls. James never rushed to her. He knew better. Instead, he sat near the fire, letting the glow remind her where she was. Once, when her trembling wouldn't ease, he said softly, Ain't no one coming through that door without meeting me first. Her gaze flicked to him then, and in it was something raw, almost like relief. She didn't speak, but her breathing slowed. It was enough. Asterisk on the 5th day, James decided she needed more than 4 walls. He saddled his horse, a steady bay named Copper, and gestured for her to follow. She hesitated, then wrapped the coat tighter and stepped into the sunlight. They walked down toward the dry creek, the land stretching wide and golden around them. Ellie kept her eyes on the ground, but when the wind shifted, she inhaled sharp, as though the smell of pine and dust was fresher than anything she'd known in months. James broke the silence. These hills'll keep you safer than most places. Harder to track a soul here. Ellie glanced at him. You really think they'll stop looking? James met her gaze, steady. Doesn't matter what they do. Matters what I do. She didn't answer, but her steps grew firmer, her chin lifting just slightly. For the first time, James thought he saw not just a survivor, but a fighter. That evening, Ellie insisted on cooking. She found dried beans and a strip of bacon. In the larder, stirred them together in the iron pot, while James chopped wood outside. When he came in, the cabin smelled of something more than smoke and dust. It smelled like home. She set 2 bowls on the table. James sat, surprised by the simple act. Don't expect much, Ellie muttered. I'm no cook. He took a bite, chewed slow, and nodded. Better than army rations. Better than most suppers I've had in years. For a moment, she looked almost pleased, almost asterisk that night. James lingered on the porch, shotgun across his lap, the sky above painted, thick with stars. He could hear Ellie moving inside, setting things in order, humming low under her breath. It startled him, not the sound itself, but the fact she had enough breath left in her to hum it all. He realized then what had been building slowly these past days. He was watching over her. Yes, but she was watching him too. Each time she set wood by the fire, each time she swept dust from the table, she was stitching herself into his life, and the cabin, long silent as a tomb, was beginning to sound like a place where people lived again. On the 7th morning, as the sun rose pink over the hills, Ellie stepped outside with a small bundle of wildflowers. She placed them in the same jar on the windowsill, their colors soft against the rough wood. James watched her quietly. When she turned, catching his eye, she shrugged, thought the place needed something besides dust. For the first time, he saw it, the brief curve of her lips, quick as a shadow but real. A smile hit him harder than a bullet. Asterisk that night, as they shared stew and coffee by lamplight, James realized the truth. He had thought he was giving her shelter. But maybe, just maybe, she was giving him something greater, a reason too. Lift his eyes from the past. The storm still waited beyond the hills. Men with cruel eyes would come again. He knew it as surely as he knew the weight of his shotgun. But for now, in the quiet warmth of the cabin, 2 broken souls had found the beginning of something neither dared name. And beginnings, James knew, were powerful things. The Arizona hills had a way of keeping secrets. Their ridges and canyons could swallow a man whole, hide him from the world, or hide the world from him. James Coulter had built his life around that truth, using the land's silence to bury his regrets. But some secrets were too cruel to stay buried. And as the days passed, he began to feel it in the air, the waiting. Ellie Rose tried to live like the hills might keep her safe. She cooked beans, swept the floor, carried water, and sometimes even let a half-smile touch her lips when James told a dry joke about how coffee could cure everything but death. But the shadows never left her eyes. Every hoofbeat on the wind made her shoulders stiffen. Every knock of a loose shutter sent her flinching. James didn't need her to tell him why. He already knew. Men like the one who'd ridden up before never quit easy. And men who carved their cruelty into flesh came back with sharper knives. It was the third evening after that banker-looking fellow had come and gone. James was whittling on the porch, the shotgun never far. Ellie was gathering herbs near the fence, her coat tied tight around her shoulders. The sun bled red behind the pines, turning the sky the color of old wounds. That's when James heard it. Hoof-beats. Not one horse this time. Several. He stood slowly, hand closing around the several. Shotgun. Ellie, he called low. She froze, listening. Her face drained of color. She didn't need telling twice. She slipped inside, shut the door soft, and crouched low by the window. James remained on the porch, his stance calm but ready. Riders appeared at the ridge road, their silhouettes black against the last fire of sunset. As they came closer, the details sharpened. The first was the same man who'd come days earlier, greasy mustache, fancy vest, the look of a man who'd never dirtied his own hands, but took pleasure in dirtying others. Beside him rode a broad-shouldered brute with scars down his jaw and a pistol swinging loose in his hand. The third was younger, mean-eyed, chewing on a toothpick like it was proof he owned the world. They reined up 20 paces from the porch. Dust settled around them, hanging heavy in the still air. "Step aside, old man," the mustached rider called, voice slick with mockery. "That girl don't belong to you. She belongs to us." James's jaw tightened, but his voice came steady. "Not any more." The younger rider spat his toothpick into the dirt. "You think you can keep her? You don't know who you're crossing." James cocked the shotgun with a sound that cracked the silence like thunder. He didn't aim yet, just made his meaning clear. The scarred man shifted in his saddle, hand drifting toward his belt. James's finger tightened on the trigger. "Don't," James said flatly. "You won't clear leather before you're on the ground." The mustached leader chuckled darkly. "You got grit, I'll give you that. But grit won't stop what's coming. That girl ran from a camp that feeds 100 men. We own her, body and soul. And if you stand in the way, we'll carve our mark into you too." Ellie's voice broke the tense quiet. She had stepped just inside the doorway, trembling but fierce. "You don't own me. Not anymore." The leader's eyes narrowed. "Ellie Rose, you keep forgetting. You ain't got a say?" James moved a step forward, the shotgun steady. "She has a say here, and I reckon I've got one too." For a moment, no one moved, and the leader smiled, cold and thin. "You'll regret this, Coulter. Next time we ride up, we won't be asking." He tugged his reins, turned his horse. The other two followed, but not before the scarred one let his hand linger on his pistol in promise. They rode off slow, dust curling behind them like smoke from a fuse. James stood still until the hoofbeats faded. Only then did he lower the shotgun. His breath came heavier than he liked to admit. Inside, Ellie leaned against the doorframe, pale, but unbroken. "They'll be back," she whispered. "I know," James answered. "You should have let them take me." "They'll kill you for this." James shook his head. "I've lived too long with nothing worth dying for. I'll take my chances." 4. The first time, her eyes filled not with fear, but with something else. Something he hadn't seen before. Gratitude, maybe. Or trust. Calling for help that night, James sat by lamplight with pen and paper. His handwriting was stiff from disuse, but the words came clear. "Abram, I've got trouble. Men chasing a girl named Ellie Rose. Mean lot. Could use a badge here? Before blood spills. Coulter." He folded the note, sealed it, and set it aside for the next supply rider who came through. Abram Hale was more than just an old war buddy. He was the sheriff now, a man whose badge carried weight across the territory. If anyone could put a lawman's shadow over this mess, It was him. But James knew the note might not reach in time. And that meant the cabin would have to hold Dot the next day. James worked like a man, fortifying a fort. He stacked firewood, not just by the stove, but near the porch rail where it could serve as cover. He oiled the shotgun, sharpened his hunting knife, checked the spare cartridges. Ellie watched him silently, then finally spoke. "You can't fight them all." "Don't need to fight them all," James replied. "Just need to hold long enough." "For what?" "For them to realize she ain't theirs anymore." She stared at him, lips pressed tight. Then, without another word, she picked up the broom and swept the porch, as if claiming the space as hers too. That evening, while James sat cleaning his gun, Ellie brought a small basket of wildflowers again. She placed it on the table, hands trembling slightly. "Why do you keep doing that?" James asked. "Because if I stop," she said softly, "then all I see is what they left on my back." James looked at her long and nodded. Fair enough. For a moment, the air between them was not heavy with fear, but with something gentler. The kind of silence that lets two souls breathe together without words. As night fell, James sat on the porch, shotgun resting across his knees. The stars above burned bright, indifferent to the troubles of men. Inside, Ellie hummed softly as she laid the flowers by the window, her voice thin but alive. James scanned the tree line, every shadow a threat, every sound a warning. He knew the storm was gathering. He could feel it pressing in, close as the night air. But he also knew this. Whatever hell rode up that ridge road again, they wouldn't find the same broken man who had once walked away from the girl in Tennessee. This time, he was ready to stand. The Arizona dawn broke hard and bright, painting the hills in copper light. James Coulter rose early, though he'd slept little. His thoughts had churned through the night, like wagon wheels in mud, grinding deeper with each turn. He knew the truth. A shotgun and a cabin wall might hold off a few riders, but they wouldn't stop a camp full of men who thought Ellie Rose was their property. If he wanted to protect her, he had to do more than fight from the shadows. He had to make her protection a matter of law, a matter of honor, something no outlaw could easily claw away. Ellie found him outside, saddling Copper. She hugged his coat tight against the morning chill. "Where are you going?" she asked, voice sharp with worry. "Town," James said simply. Her eyes widened. "You can't, if they see you with me. That's the point." He cinched the saddle tight. "They need to see. Need to know you ain't alone anymore." Ellie shook her head. "James, they'll kill you." He met her gaze, steady. "Maybe, but hiding won't keep you safe. Making it known you're under my roof will." Her lips parted, trembling between fear and something else. "Why would you do that?" James rested a hand on Copper's mane, his voice low. "Because I walked away once, and I ain't ever doing it again." The road to town wound dusty and long, the sun already hot on his shoulders. Ellie rode behind him on Copper, her arms around his waist, her grip tight as if the world might snatch her away if she let go. James kept his eyes forward, scanning the horizon, every shadow on the ridge a possible ambush. The town of Willow Creek wasn't much, a few weathered storefronts, a saloon, a church, and a courthouse that doubled as the sheriff's office. But in the West, appearances didn't matter as much as presence. A man standing firm in front of witnesses meant something. And today, James intended to stand firm. When they arrived, heads turned. James Coulter rarely came to town. To see him stride down Main Street with a ragged woman wrapped in his coat trailing close behind was enough to draw whispers from every porch. He walked straight into the courthouse. Sheriff Abram Hale looked up from behind his desk, surprise breaking into a grin. Abram was broad-shouldered, with a badge that gleamed against his vest. and the kind of eyes that had seen too much, but still carried steady light. "Coulter," Abram said, standing. "Thought you'd gone and married your solitude for good." His gaze shifted to Ellie, and the humor faded. He saw the scars in her eyes as quick as James had. "What's this?" James rested his hands on the desk. "This is Ellie Rose. She ran from men who think they own her. They rode to my place, claimed her like cattle. I told them no." Abram's jaw tightened. "That camp up north, I've heard whispers. Men disappearing, women worked near to death. No proof, though." "Not yet." "You've got proof now," James said. "She's living and breathing witness." Abram's eyes moved between them. Then he nodded slowly. "All right. You want me to put her under the law's protection?" James took a deep breath. "I want more than that. I want it written down. She's mine, not theirs." Ellie gasped softly, turning to him. "Yours?" James met her eyes. "By marriage, if you'll have it. Ain't about chains. It's about shield. If they come again, they won't just be stealing a runaway. They'll be crossing me and the law." The marriage of convenience. The courthouse was quiet, save for the scratching of Abram's pen as he filled out the papers. Ellie stood trembling, caught between disbelief and fear. "James," she whispered. "Why would you?" "Because—" James cut her off gently. "The only way they'll stop is if you stop being prey in their eyes. You'll have my name, my land, my protection. Ain't much of a gift, but it's what I've got." Ellie's eyes shimmered. "And if I say no?" James's expression softened. "Then I'll still stand with you. But I can't promise the law will." The room felt like it held its breath. Then slowly, Ellie nodded. "All right." Her voice cracked but didn't falter. "I'll take it." Abram cleared his throat, pulling out a worn Bible. "Well then, let's do it proper." The vows were short, spoken low, without flourish. James's voice rumbled steady. Ellie's shook but held. When Abram declared them man and wife, the weight in the room shifted. Ellie Rose was no longer just a runaway. She was Mrs. Coulter now, under name, law, and oath. By the time they stepped outside, the whole town seemed to know. Whispers flew fast as prairie fire. James Coulter, the reclusive rancher, had married a ragged stranger. Some smirked, some frowned. But all understood one thing. Ellie Rose was under his protection now. And protection in the West was as good as a line drawn in blood. They stopped at the general store for supplies. Ellie held her head low, but James stood tall, daring anyone to speak against it. When he paid for flour and salt, he placed a gold coin on the counter, a reminder that he was not some poor grifter, but a man with means. On the way out, a figure blocked their path. The mustached rider. He leaned against a post, hat low, eyes full of malice. "Well, well," he drawled, "ain't this sweet?" Old man found himself a bride. His smile twisted. "Don't matter what paper you signed. She'd never belong to you." James stepped close, towering over him. "You listen well. She's mine now, by name, by law, by God. You touch her again, you're not just crossing me. You're crossing every man in this town who respects a vow." The man sneered, but said nothing. He wasn't ready to draw, not in front of witnesses. He spat in the dust and stalked off, but his eyes promised reckoning. The ride home was quieter. Ellie sat behind him, her arms looser around his waist now, but her silence heavy. At last she spoke. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered. Double quotes. "Yes, I did," James answered. "You tied yourself to me. You don't even know if I'll ever be whole again." James's gaze stayed on the horizon. "Don't need you whole. Just need you alive." Her arms tightened around him, not in fear, but in something closer to trust. That night, in the cabin, The flowers still glowed faint by lamplight. Ellie sat at the table, hands folded, staring at the marriage paper Abram had given them. James sat across from her, cleaning his shotgun as though it were Sunday ritual. The silence stretched, but it wasn't the silence of strangers anymore. It was the silence of two people bound by choice, however strange and sudden. Beyond the walls, the hills waited, and so did the men who would not let go. But now James and Ellie had drawn their line, and in the West, once a line was drawn, there was no stepping back. The hills of Arizona were too quiet. James Coulter had lived long enough on the land to know the difference between peace and silence. Peace was birdsong at dawn, cattle lowing in the distance, the rustle of wind through pines. Silence was when the world held its breath, waiting for violence. And for 3 days after he married Ellie Rose, silence wrapped the ridge like a noose. James spent those days sharpening tools, stacking wood where it could serve as cover, and keeping his shotgun across his lap. Ellie helped in her own way, cooking, sweeping, trying to keep the cabin feeling like a home and not a fort. But he could see it in her eyes. She felt the waiting, too. "They won't let it go," she said one morning, watching him clean his rifle. "I know," James answered. "They'll come with more men." He looked up, meeting her gaze. "Then we'll meet them with more courage." Her lips trembled, but she nodded. It was late afternoon when the stillness broke. James was on the porch, oiling the shotgun. Ellie was inside, humming faintly as she folded the same coat she'd clung to on that first night. Then he heard it, hoofbeats, not hurried but deliberate. The kind of rhythm men rode when they came to claim something. James stood, every muscle tightening. Dust rose on the Ridge Road, 5 riders this time. At their head, the mustached man, greasy vest, smug cruelty in his eyes. Behind him, this scarred brute, the toothpick chewer, and 2 more mean-looking men armed with rifles. Ellie appeared at the doorway, face pale, hands gripping the frame. James motioned her back, but she shook her head, unwilling to hide. The leader reined up, tipping his hat mockingly. "Afternoon, Mr. Coulter. Or should I say husband?" His smile twisted. "Brought friends this time. Figured you might. Not want to be alone when we take back what's ours." "She's not yours," James said evenly. "She's my wife." The scarred man laughed, a sound like gravel. "Paper and preacher don't change the brand on her back." James lifted the shotgun, steady. "Step off my land." The younger one chewed his toothpick, smirking. "Or what? You'll shoot all 5 of us?" "If I have to." The standoff stretched. The men shifted in their saddles, hands inching toward. Pistols. James's finger curled tighter on the trigger. Then the scarred man made his move, swinging his pistol up. The shotgun roared, the blast echoing off the hills. The scarred man tumbled from his horse, leg torn open, blood pooling fast in the dust. His scream split the air, the horses rearing. The other men froze. James pumped the shotgun, smoke curling from the barrel. "Next man moves," James said, voice like iron. "Don't get up again." Before another shot could be fired, a voice rang out from the trees. Calm, steady, worn like leather. "I'd think real hard about your next move, boys." Out stepped Abram Hale, rifle slung low, badge glinting in the fading sun. He walked with the surety of a man who'd faced gun barrels before and never blinked. "This here's my jurisdiction," Abram said, eyes sweeping the riders. "And Mrs. Coulter's under my protection now." The mustached leader cursed under his breath, fury sparking in his eyes. But with Abram's rifle trained steady and James's shotgun ready to speak again, even his arrogance faltered. "You think this ends here?" The leader snarled. "You can't hide her forever. That camp don't forget." Abram's voice hardened. "Maybe not, but the law remembers too." You so much as ride into this valley again, I'll see you swing." The younger rider spat, glaring. The two extras shifted uneasily, not eager to test rifles against their pistols. At last, the leader tugged his reins. "Mount up," he barked. They turned slow, dragging the wounded man between them, retreating with curses trailing like dust. Aftermath in the quiet. The silence returned, heavy but different. James lowered the shotgun, shoulders tense. Abram approached, clapping a hand on his old friend's shoulder. "You send me a note that smells like gunpowder and regret," Abram said with a half-smile. "I figured it was serious." James allowed the faintest chuckle. "Glad you listened." Ellie stepped forward, trembling but upright. "Thank you," she whispered to Abram. He tipped his hat. "Don't thank me yet. Men like that don't quit easy. They'll lick their wounds and come back meaner. But at least now they know the law's watching." That night, the cabin glowed with firelight. James sat at the table, cleaning his shotgun again, though it hardly needed it. Ellie moved around the small room with quiet purpose, setting stew on the stove, folding blankets. "You didn't have to shoot him," she said softly. "Yes, I did," James replied. "He would have killed me. Maybe you too." She lowered her eyes. I don't want blood spilled for me." James's gaze softened. "Ellie, blood was already spilled. Only question is whose." Her eyes shimmered, but she said no more. Later, as she slept, James sat on the porch with Abram beside him. The sheriff smoked a thin cigar, the ember glowing in the dark. "They'll regroup," Abram said. "I know. You ready for that?" James glanced back at the cabin where Ellie slept. "I'll be ready." The following morning, Ellie joined James on the porch with 2 cups of coffee. Her hands shook less now as she passed him one. "I used to think," she said quietly, "that no one would ever stand for me, that I wasn't worth it." James looked at her, eyes steady. "You're worth more than they'll ever understand." Her lips trembled, and for the first time, she let herself smile. A true smile, soft but real. James felt it in his chest like sunrise, breaking through a storm. The hills were still, but no longer silent. Somewhere beyond, men plotted revenge. James knew it. Abram knew it. Ellie felt it. But for now, the cabin breathed with something stronger than fear, resolve. The war wasn't over. The real fight was yet to come. But James Coulter had already made his choice. He would not walk away. Not this time. And when the storm came again, he would be the one standing. The days after the gunfight felt like the land itself was holding its breath. James Coulter kept his shotgun close. Abram Heil lingered near the ridge whenever duty allowed, and Ellie Rose carried herself with a new steadiness, though the shadow of fear never left her eyes entirely. The cabin, once silent as a grave, now throbbed with life. Ellie cooked and hummed. James worked the fences again. Abram brought news from town. Yet beneath every chore lay the same truth. The men who had carved their cruelty into Ellie's back would not stop. They'd been driven off, but not broken. And broken men were dangerous. It was near midnight when Abram burst through the cabin door, rifle in hand. His face was grim, jaw set. "They're coming," he said. "Not 5 this time, a dozen, maybe more. Word is, the camp emptied half its men to bring her back." Ellie's face went pale. James rose, steady as stone. "How long?" "Hour, maybe less. They're riding hard." James nodded, already moving. He stacked crates against the windows, scattered extra cartridges across the table. Ellie fetched water, her hands trembling but determined. Abram set himself by the door, checking his rifle with the calm of a man who'd walked into storms before. The cabin wasn't much. Rough-hewn logs, 1 door, 2 small windows. But with courage and resolve, It could be a fortress. Hoofbeats thundered down the ridge road, dust rising like smoke in the moonlight. Shouts carried through the night air. Cruel laughter, the crack of whips, the promise of violence. Then came the pounding. Fists and boots against the door, voices snarling. "Hand her over, Coulter. Ain't no law up here that can keep her from us." James stood in the center of the cabin, shotgun steady, Ellie behind him. Abram called back through the door, voice hard as iron. "There's law enough right here. You're trespassing on my jurisdiction. Leave now, or face the gallows." A roar of laughter answered, then gunfire. Bullets shattered the windows, splinters flying. Ellie ducked, covering her. Head. James returned fire, the shotgun booming, scattering the first wave of attackers. Abram fired next, dropping a rider from his horse. The battle was chaos, smoke, shouting, gunfire cracking through the night. Horses screamed, men cursed. James moved like a man possessed, each shot measured, each step purposeful. Abram held the line with steady precision, his rifle barking fire. Through it all, Ellie crouched low, clutching a pistol James had pressed into her hand. She didn't fire yet, but her grip was steady. The mustached leader strode forward in the chaos, arrogance still painted across his face. He fired into the cabin, the bullet tearing through the wall inches from Ellie's head. Ellie rose. He shouted, "You're mine. Always were, always will be." Something broke inside Ellie then, not into fear, but into fire. She rose from her crouch, the pistol in her hand trembling only for a second. Then she pulled the trigger. The shot cracked sharp and true. The leader staggered, clutching his arm, blood dark against his vest. His howl of rage split the night. James's shotgun boomed again, dropping another of the men. Abram fired at the rest, his voice carrying like thunder. "Law's here, you bastards. Drop your guns or die where you stand." The tide shifted. Men who had ridden in certain of conquest faltered. Their leader was wounded, their numbers cut, their arrogance shaken. One by one, they turned, dragging their injured with them. The ridge echoed with hoofbeats retreating into the night. The cabin was left smoking, windows shattered, door battered, but still standing. James lowered the shotgun, chest heaving. Abram leaned against the wall, reloading calmly. Ellie still held the pistol, her hand shaking now that the danger had passed. James stepped to her, gently easing it from her grip. "You did it?" he said softly. "You stood." Her eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. "I had to. I couldn't let him own me anymore." James's voice was rough, but steady. "He never did. Not once you walked onto my land." By dawn, Abram had rounded up the wounded left behind. The mustached leader was among them, bleeding and cursing, his cruelty now stripped of power. Abram tied his hands, tossing him into the back of a wagon. "You'll hang," Abram told him flatly. "For every scar you carved, for every life you broke." The man spat, but his eyes held fear now. Fear of justice, fear of being powerless at last. James stood beside Ellie as the wagon rolled away. She leaned slightly against him, exhausted but unbroken. "They won't come back," she whispered. "No," James agreed. Not again. The next days were filled with mending. Abram returned to town with prisoners, leaving James and Ellie to patch their cabin and their wounds. The windows were boarded, the door reinforced, the walls scrubbed of bullet scars. The truest healing happened between them. Ellie no longer shrank from every sound. She laughed once, a quiet, trembling laugh over burnt stew. James nearly dropped his spoon hearing it, so rare and precious. At night, she still woke from dreams, but now James was there beside her, his arm steady across her shoulders until her breathing eased. She began to believe in safety again. And James, for the first time in 12 years, began to believe in life again. On the third morning after the battle, Ellie set a fresh jar of wildflowers on the windowsill. The sun spilled golden light through the cracked glass, catching the colors like jewels. James watched her, his chest full of something he hadn't felt since before Tennessee. Hope. The land was quiet again. But this time it wasn't silence. Waiting for violence, it was peace. Justice had been served. And though the scars would never vanish, both he and Ellie had found something worth carrying forward, together. The Arizona hills were no strangers to scars. Dry creek beds cut deep into the land. Jagged canyons told stories of floods long gone, and every twisted mesquite bore the mark of wind and time. James Coulter knew the land's scars as well as his own. But in the days after the showdown, as the cabin filled with light and quiet laughter, he realized scars weren't just reminders of pain. They were proof of survival. Ellie Rose moved through the small home with a gentleness that had nothing to do with fragility. She placed flowers on the windowsill, scrubbed the dust from corners James hadn't touched in years, even stitched fresh curtains from burlap flour sacks. With each small act, she rewrote the memory of the place. Where once the cabin had been a graveyard of silence, it now breathed like a living thing. James watched her often quietly. He marveled at the strength behind her soft hands, the way she carried herself not as someone broken, but as someone choosing to begin again. And in her presence, he too felt something stirring, something he thought the war and the years had buried for good. One evening, as twilight painted the horizon purple, James sat on the porch sharpening a knife. Ellie joined him, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She handed him one, her fingers brushing his. "You still keeping watch every night?" she asked softly. James nodded. "Habits hard to break." Her gaze swept the ridge. "But they're gone now. Abram took the rest. The leader'll hang." "Doesn't mean shadows won't come again," James said. He paused, then added, "But I reckon I'm not watching just for them anymore." Her brow furrowed. "Then who?" His eyes met hers, steady, unflinching. "You?" Her breath caught. She turned away, sipping coffee to steady herself. But her lips trembled in a way that wasn't fear. Later that night, a storm rolled across the hills. Rain hammered the roof. Wind howled against the shutters. Inside, the fire crackled, filling the room with warmth. James sat across from Ellie, the lamplight soft against her face. "You ever think," she said quietly, "that maybe we were meant to find each other? That the world pushed me out of those woods for a reason?" James stared into the flames. "I used to think my story ended a long time ago, that I was just waiting for the ground to take me. But you," he shook his head, voice rough, "you reminded me I ain't done yet." Ellie's eyes glistened. "You gave me back more than my life, James. You gave me a choice. I haven't had that in years." The silence stretched, heavy with all they hadn't said. Then, with courage that surprised even herself, Ellie reached across the table and laid her hand on his. For a long time, James didn't move. Then, slowly, he turned his hand to hold hers, his rough fingers curling gently around hers. Days later, the sun rose clear after the storm. The land smelled of wet earth and pine, fresh and alive. James and Ellie worked side by side, mending a section of fence washed loose by the rain. They moved in rhythm, him hammering, her holding board steady. At one point, their hands met. Over a plank, both reaching at once. They froze, eyes locking. Something unspoken passed between them, stronger than words, older than fear. James's heart hammered in his chest. He had faced bullets without blinking, but this moment unraveled him. Ellie tilted her face up, her eyes steady now, no longer broken, but fierce with life. James bent, slow and careful, as though the world might shatter if he moved too quick. There. Lips met, soft, hesitant, then deepening with the weight of all they had endured. When they pulled apart, Ellie's hand lingered on his chest, her smile trembling but radiant. For the first time, she whispered, "I feel like I belong. Somewhere." James's voice was hoarse. "For the first time in years, I feel alive." The cabin changed after that. Not in grand ways, but in quiet ones. Ellie planted a small patch of herbs near the porch. James swept the floors each morning without her, asking. Together, they began to build something neither had dared to dream of. A future dot at night. James still kept his shotgun close. But now, when Ellie woke from dark dreams, she found his arm around her, steady as the land itself. And in those moments, she began to believe in more than safety. She began to believe in love. James, for his part, found his grief softening. Tennessee still haunted him, the girl he hadn't saved. But Ellie was not her. Ellie was herself, strong and scarred and alive. And maybe that was enough. Maybe more than enough. On a warm evening weeks later, James sat on the porch with Ellie at his side. The hills stretched golden in the fading sun. Birds called in the distance, and the air smelled of sage. Ellie leaned against him, her head on his shoulder. "Do you think we'll ever be truly safe?" she asked. James kissed the top of her hair. "Safe? Maybe not. But together? Always." She closed her eyes, content. For the first time in a long time, James Coulter let himself smile. Storm had passed. Justice had been served. And though scars would always remain, love had found a way to bloom in the desert. Out here in the West, stories don't end. They ride on in every sunrise, every quiet act of kindness, every moment when someone chooses not to walk away. If this tale of courage, justice, and love spoke to you, don't let it ride alone. Give it a like, share it with a friend, and subscribe to join us for the next story from the heart of the frontier. Because out here, legends live as long as folks keep telling them.